Where you see this whole town swept away.
This is the town of Rikuzentaka. There were 24,000 people here. And look at the way every house is just being washed away. And look at the building in the front and see what happens as this wave of water, which in some places is up to 10 metres high, hits the building.
And we have no sense, as yet, as to the number of people who may or may not have still been in this particular town. Let's go to the second images here.
This is Miyako Port.
Now, what strikes you looking at these images? That the waves do not seem very high, but it is the force.
The water is shallow, but it is the force of it, as it's being driven by the power of this huge volume of water behind it, surging towards the coast, that causes this massive destruction. Now watch here, this is a little bit further inland. This is up near Sendai, the main city which is closest to the epicenter of the quake. And this vast wall of debris, you can see boats in the bottom right-hand corner here, as it comes towards this canal and just literally overflows it. And it's this debris which is the really most dangerous part of this, because anything in the path of the debris gets smashed to pieces by all the wreckage. And just watch the way it's relentless. It just goes forward across the fields, this great surge of water. Here's this big boat again in the top of the screen now, and watch this boat as it comes round here.
Because at that speed, you feel as though the wave is about to stop.
But it doesn't. It just
keeps
see cars just
moving
in front of it, just trying to escape away from it. It is almost biblical in its proportions. And it doesn't stop. It keeps coming. This is just a continuous shot. And even the fires that have started burning are picked up and carried by the water as they get pulled along. Now watch now as the camera pulls out, and you can see it beginning to engulf a few buildings on the right-hand side. But at the bottom here again, here is this boat we saw earlier being carried along. In the foreground now, just at the bottom of the screen, an articulated lorry. Just below the bottom of the screen is the road where we saw those cars running along. And watch how the lorry is just picked up and taken away. And then just carry on watching for a moment or two here as well. There's the boat being pushed along past the buildings. And look up, further up, you can now see the sheer extent of all of this. Up at the top of the screen, the rest of the water coming across.
And you can see people trying to escape. There's someone driving away there.
Watch the car on the very right-hand side of the screen as it tries to escape and then realises that they can't escape because the debris and the wall of water is already pushing itself across the road. And on the right-hand side, very faint, there's a person running along the road on the right-hand side of the screen. It is quite an extraordinary sense of just the way that this tsunami just floods in and doesn't stop. It just goes on and on and on, utterly terrifying. And
this is why we have very little sense of the actual casualty rate. Let's go to the next really striking image today, this whirlpool effect created what seems out at sea.
This is quite extraordinary. It looks, in fact, far worse than it really is, but it's what happens when the tsunami and the wave of water hits the coast and you get swirls and eddies coming round. We've no idea what happened to this boat in the foreground here. We have no idea whether it was called. But if you pull, as the camera pulls back, you can see that we're actually close up to the coast, and it is just like a swirl and an eddy created as it comes in.
So it's actually that swirl seems to actually have been created by the physical barrier.
That's right. As the wave hits the shoreline, what is quite only a ½ metre increase becomes this wall of water, because the water had to go somewhere, so it builds up and then starts swirling around.
All right, well, let's go to the images that we've grown, I suppose, more familiar with now, again, which is the images of the earthquake itself and the shaking.
That's right. I mean, this is an 8.9 magnitude. It is enormous in earthquake terms. In fact, there's one of this sort of scale around every year. This is inside the airport. You can see the ceiling coming down. And watch the people in a moment. They're doing exactly the right thing. They're sheltering in the doorway, because the doorways of buildings are the strongest part. It's where you're always instructed to go. And then coming up here, this is Yokohama, and this is, you get a sense of the panic in people. And watch behind her as what happens. The building collapses, people coming running out of the building. Even though Japan is a country which is well used to earthquakes, has buildings that are designed and constructed in order to be able to withstand earthquakes, still there's enormous panic as people wonder what to do.
That in truth is the amazing thing, though, isn't it? An earthquake this size causing relatively little physical damage.
Relatively little physical damage.
If you think about the Christchurch earthquake, by comparison, much, much smaller.
This is 1,000 times more powerful than Christchurch. And if you look back in the past, the previous biggest earthquake in Japan was in 1923, and that killed 147,000 people.
A super earthquake and nowhere to hide. And then an even greater horror, a tsunami that sent a giant wall of water racing towards the coast, tossing cars, boats and buildings like fragile toys. It was exactly 2:46 p.m. local time when the earthquake struck. This was in the local government office in the city of Sendai, close to the epicenter. Papers, furniture, nothing was safe. This was the local air terminal where the ceiling collapsed. As far as hundreds of miles south in Tokyo, offices, homes and shops shook and rocked, leaving some people in tower blocks trapped without escape.
When it really started to get quite serious, the shaking, at that point I just thought, I could possibly die now. I mean, this is, I don't know if I can get down the stairs in time to reach the bottom floor. And then I also had my wife like screaming down my ear because she was working in one of the buildings in Tokyo.
For those living by the coast, worse was to come. The 23-foot tsunami triggered by the quake reached the shore with terrifying speed. Boats broke away from moorings, splintering as though made of matchsticks. Whole buildings collapsed into the water. These images from Japanese TV show the terrible power of the water, sweeping away whole shipping containers and crushing buildings like tin cans. One entire ship carrying dozens of dock workers was simply swept away. Here in Miyako, the entire port was submerged. Cars and vans and even houses were swept up in the swirling current. One building here on fire. And further inland, the black wall of water continued its relentless onslaught over fields. Thick with debris, it absorbed everything in its path. Many abandoned homes were left half underwater. Not everyone managed to get away. In Tokyo, the tremors also caused havoc at the Parliament building. The Prime Minister went on television to brief the nation.
It was a very strong earthquake, and in the Tohoku region, mainly and over a wide area, damage has been inflicted. I offer my deepest sympathy to the people who have suffered the disaster.
And a further cause for alarm, damage to infrastructure. This oil refinery east of Tokyo caught fire as a result of the quake and then exploded to rage out of control. The flames billowed over 100 feet into the air, blazing like a fireball for hours. There were also, worryingly, incidents at 2 nuclear plants. They shut down automatically when the tremors began, but a small blaze started in the turbine hall of one, and the cooling system failed in the other. Local residents were evacuated as a precaution. Transport links in the region hit by the disaster were also affected. In some places, roads buckled or cracked wide open, leaving gaping holes. Other coastal roads were swept away, or motorists found themselves stranded on bypasses, watching the swirling muddy water below, littered with debris, smashing into the embankment. And the airport in Sendai was completely submerged. The water crept up the runway. Passengers took refuge on the roof of the terminal building. In Tokyo, thousands of commuters were stranded when rail and road links ground to a halt. The BBC's Tokyo correspondent, Roland Burke, witnessed their desperation.
Just look at this, a huge line stretching down into the distance, people waiting